Hi, my name is Ashley Davidson. I'm a registered psychotherapist here at Energy Tap. I specialize in addictions, so specifically substance use concerns, co-occurring mental health, and behavioral addictions. And if you're unfamiliar with what behavioral addictions are, they're when people struggle with problematic gambling, tech overuse, which can be through gaming or social media, overspending issues or collecting, as well as hypersexuality. So I find it important in my work to educate people on the physiological changes that occur when somebody struggles with addiction. Addiction is when a behavior or a substance starts to negatively affect your life, whether it's your work or through your school performance. Your mental health starts to decline, your physical health, your relationships, or sometimes your financial wellness. What many people don't know is that addiction occurs in our brains as well as our bodies. And so changes occur to the brain, and I find it really important to educate people on this. So in order to teach you this, I have to take you back to about grade 7 science. So there's going to be some funky language in here. We're first going to start with the idea of neurotransmitters. So this is how the brain works to send chemical messages back and forth. So as I stand here today, I'm sending you a verbal message, and if you're on the other end listening, you're receiving it. And that's kind of how our brain works. Now, one of the chemicals that we do produce that's really closely attached to addiction is dopamine. If you're unfamiliar with dopamine, dopamine is connected to the pleasure center in our brain. We also feel very motivated to engage in that activity or behavior when things feel so good, because it lights up the reward center in our brain. So if it feels good, we're likely to do it again and again because we perceive that we are benefiting from it. So we produce dopamine from healthy or unhealthy activities. In order to show you, it's important to teach you a little bit about homeostasis. If you're unfamiliar with that term, homeostasis is when we feel balance. So in this day and age, in this society, it's really impossible to be in a balanced state all the time because we have peaks and valleys, highs and lows. So dopamine is part of when we have those highs. Think about exercise. A lot of people really enjoy exercise. So what happens through the process of working out for 30, 45 minutes is we get this surge of dopamine and endorphins, and it feels really comfortable. After a workout, you may notice that you're tired. So what that signals is that your dopamine is starting to deplete. Now, some people think that we just exercise and then go back to our homeostasis, but really, we actually dig a little deeper and we go into what is called a recovery mode. So picture this, the amount of energy that you put into producing the dopamine, you actually have to put the same amount into your recovery. So what that looks like after the gym is people usually go home, they have a snack, maybe they change, shower, put on a Netflix episode. After that, within a few hours, for some people in the evening, they return back to their homeostasis and they go on with life. Another activity that people enjoy is food. Now, it may be Thursday today, and I'm thinking about rewarding myself with a pizza tomorrow on Friday. What happens is on this day that I'm thinking about pizza, my dopamine is starting to produce already. Yours might be too if you're a fan of pizza. So what happens is on Thursday, thinking about the pizza, dopamine starts to produce. I'm thinking about where I want to go, what toppings I want to have, who I want to share it with. And so by the time Friday hits and I take that bite of that first slice, I've produced an excess of dopamine. Then what happens is I eat some or almost all of the pizza and I go into my recovery mode. And that means I'm full, probably watching Netflix again, and I'll return to my baseline shortly after. For other people, they engage in sex. Sex, it can be a healthy activity that produces a lot of dopamine. So the dopamine production might be a little bit higher for sex, and then after sex, well, you may know what happens. We get tired and we go into our recovery mode. It's not. So remember, this is what the healthy production of dopamine looks like. Now, over time, what these become are expected rewards, meaning that when we exercise, the brain understands how we're going to feel and what we're going to get out of it. When we eat, we can usually anticipate what that meal is going to be like for us. So the brain kind of gets used to these activities. When you introduce a substance or a behavioral addiction, the brain actually produces an excess amount of dopamine that it's not used to. It can be 2 to 3 times the amount of dopamine when we're considering substances. So what happens is you get this rush of dopamine. You feel really good. Some people call that their first high, their first rush. And then what happens is usually there is a crash. Because remember what we learned, the energy that you put into that activity, you need to recover. So what do we know about substance use issues? When it's problematic, a person isn't just using and then going back to all the other things that are healthy for them. They actually use again much sooner. A lot of people will say, I'm chasing that high, or with gambling, I'm chasing that win. And so when they go back, what's interesting is the rush is not the same, but the crash actually becomes a little deeper. And a person may be thinking, I still like this. I want to have again. So they go back, the rush is a little bit lower, and again, that crash is deeper. Now this actually becomes a cycle. So you go back, and over time, this is what starts to happen to your dopamine level. As you can see, you're no longer hitting your homeostasis, your baseline where you feel in balance or where you're feeling comfortable. You may be thinking, well, this doesn't make sense. What starts to happen that the brain builds a tolerance for the dopamine that it's producing. It's like, yeah, you've had a couple drinks, but what more can you do? And so this is where we'll see some people really push it to the limits in addiction, because they're like, I want that high again. I want that good feeling, that good rush, that experience that I once had. But when you're no longer having that, it shows that there's now a tolerance and a dependency in the brain. The dependency signals that even when people do try to stop drinking or using in between, the brain has these really intense urges and cravings, and it's like, well, wait a second, what are you doing? Why aren't we doing this when it's more exciting? And so know that the physiological changes that occur are tolerance and dependency in the brain. Now focusing on what's happening over here, you'll notice that the rush and the dopamine production is no longer hitting our homeostasis levels. What actually happens is over time, when people struggle with addiction, they create a new baseline. Some of you watching this may be very familiar. You may be sitting in the new baseline now. What this new baseline represents is depression, anxiety. For some people, this is where they'll have panic attacks. They may feel suicidal, have no energy, no motivation. Becomes really hard to make a change. this becomes a person's new normal when they struggle with addiction. A lot of times, when we're looking around here, a loved one, close person in their life will start to notice, you're looking different, you're sounding different, you're not showing up for opportunities or experiences with us. And they may be aware that there's a substance use issue, and they'll say, well, why can't you just stop? It's really important to know that if it was that easy, I'm sure more people would. But because of the physiological changes in the brain, because tolerance, the brain has made room for a substance or behavioral addiction like gambling. There's a dependency, so a person has a hard time breaking that cycle. Why? Because when they're still using, even though their baseline is low, they're still producing dopamine. So it's temporary relief from their baseline, from their depression, from their anxiety.